The taro leaves were gone by morning. On Moorea in the 1960s, a farmer pushed through his patch and found stems stripped to ribbons, the ground slick with slime trails thick as rope. Giant African land snails had arrived, each one nearly the size of a man's fist, grinding through crops like a machine. Within months, gardens across the Society Islands were collapsing. Agricultural officers panicked. Something had to stop the invasion, and fast. Their fix seemed elegant. A predatory snail called Euglandina rosea, the rosy wolfsnail, known for devouring pests with cold efficiency. They released it by the thousands, sure it would hunt the giant snails into submission. But the rosy wolfsnail did not attack the armored adults it was sent to find. It turned instead toward softer prey, small tree snails called Partula, native to these islands, with no predator in millions of years of isolation. The hunters climbed into the canopy, following slime trails upward, and began wiping out species after species from the only home they had ever known. What happens when a weapon built for one enemy finds an island full of prey that cannot fight back? Teva knelt in his taro patch one morning and found a shell the size of his fist grinding through a green stalk. It moved slow, but its mouth worked fast, faster than any native snail, faster than anything the island had seen. Achatina fulica, the giant African land snail, had reached Moorea. No one knew when it crossed the ocean. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. One adult could lay 1,200 eggs in a year. 1,200. Each hatchling emerged hungry and grew fast, swelling to 20 centimeters of pure appetite. They moved through gardens like a slow flood, stripping banana plants, devouring papaya seedlings, turning tended plots into slime trails and ruin. Agricultural officers walked the fields and saw the future, an island where every crop surrendered to a foreign mollusk that outbred every native competitor. The farmers demanded action. The government needed a weapon, and in the panic to save the harvest, no one stopped to ask what else might burn when they lit the match. The weapon they chose was a snail that ate other snails. Euglandina rosea, the rosy wolf snail, came from the humid forests of the southeastern United States. It was sleek, fast, and hungry. Agricultural officers had already shipped it to Hawaii with reported success. Now they boxed up hundreds and flew them to Moorea. The plan was simple. The wolf snail would find the giant African snail's eggs and young, which were small and soft, and tear through the next generation before the pest could recover. The adults were too large for Euglandina to tackle. That was the assumption. No one seemed to notice that the rosy wolf snail had never signed a contract. It was a generalist predator on an island full of slow, bite-sized prey that had never learned to hide. The hunters were released. The forest waited. Would the wolf snail keep to its intended menu? Or would something softer, something smaller, something that had never known fear, catch its wandering eye? Brian Clark walked his usual trail through the Moorea forest in the late 70s. He looked up at the trees where Partula taeniata should have been grazing, their striped shells catching the light. Empty. He checked the next grove. Empty again. Then he found the first shell on the forest floor, clean and hollow, the soft body gone. The wolf snail had climbed. It followed the Partula's own mucus trails up the bark, into the canopy where nothing had ever pursued them. These snails gave birth to live young, one at a time every few weeks. No eggs hidden in soil, no 1,000-strong broods to absorb the losses. Each death was a species' future vanishing. Clark watched Euglandina work. It was not eating the giant African snails. The adults were too large, the eggs too well hidden, so it hunted the Partula instead, smaller than its own shell, defenseless, unhurried, their evolution a closed book with no chapter on escape. Species after species began to disappear. Empty shells accumulated like dropped beads. The forest that had sculpted dozens of unique forms over millions of years was now unmaking them in months. With no defense and such slow reproduction, how fast would whole species vanish? Brian Clark stood among the empty shells and saw the future. Euglandina could not be stopped. No poison touched it alone, no barrier held. The Wolfsnail had reached every grove on Moorea, and each grove was a grave in progress. Clark spoke the words no naturalist wants to say. We can't save them here. We have to take them out. The goal changed that day, not rescue in place, salvage. A handful of scientists spread across the island, searching for living Partula in pockets the predator had not yet drained. Each species needed representatives, not hundreds. A dozen would do. A few mated pairs if they were lucky. They worked against a clock they measured only in shells. James Murray helped match species to zoos that could keep them alive. The snails were delicate. They needed precise humidity, specific fungi, the exact temperature of their home forest. A terrarium was not a mountain valley, but a terrarium was all that remained. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a hunting ground, and the collectors were running out of places to look. On a slope above Opunohu Bay, a collector knelt in wet leaves. His fingers trembled as he coaxed a single Partula teoniata into a glass vial. Its shell was old amber, banded with chestnut. Above him, on the same branch, a rosy Wolfsnail glided closer. He did not look up. There was no time. Every capture was theft from a dying population, and every theft was mercy. They gathered Partula suturalis from a breadfruit tree near the valley floor. They found Partula moreana in a grove already half empty, bark scarred with slime trails. Each vial held a species. Each species held a lineage older than human memory. The snails flew to London, Edinburgh, St. Louis. Climate-controlled rooms became their new forests. Keepers studied humidity charts like battlefield maps. The snails ate slowly. They mated sometimes. Then, one morning, a keeper in London noticed something. The labels had changed. These were no longer rare residents of Moorea. They were ghosts in a box. Extinct in the wild, still breathing. But breathing was not breeding. And a species that does not breed is merely postponing its ending. Then, a peppercorn moved. In a London zoo terrarium, a keeper's breath caught. The first captive Partula baby had emerged, glistening, barely visible, alive. Paul Pierce Kelly logged it in a studbook that traced every lineage like royal bloodlines. These snails were not rabbits. One offspring every few weeks if fortune allowed. Some pairs never bred at all. Years accumulated in climate-controlled rooms. Keepers became historians, then inheritors, then the only witnesses left standing. Meanwhile, the forests they came from went quiet. The breadfruit groves of Moorea stopped rustling with tiny shells. Many of the species Henry Crampton had collected, many Brian Clark had studied, simply never appeared again. Their shell shapes survived only in museum drawers, now labeled with dates that ended in the 1980s. The paradox settled like ash. The snails were saved from nothingness, yet they were utterly absent from the world that had sculpted them. They breathed in boxes. They bred in boxes. They were alive, and they were nowhere. So the question became unavoidable. Is there any path back to the wild, or are these snails forever museum pieces? Paul Pierce Kelly stood on a motu at dawn. The islet was barely 2 football fields of green, ringed by water too rough for most boats. He opened a container and lifted out a Partula snail, its shell no bigger than a fingernail. He set it on a wet hibiscus leaf, The snail unfurled its eye stalks and began to move. Its ancestors had left this same branch a generation before. Now, after 30 years in London and St. Louis and Edinburgh, a few hundred snails were coming home. But home had changed. The main island still crawled with Rosy Wolfsnails. Every leaf, every trunk, every shipment had to be checked. One stowaway predator could erase a decade of breeding in a single week. The motu was predator-free for now. Fenced reserves on Tahiti and Moorea offered more space, less safety. The released snails crept into the canopy and vanished. Keepers held their breath. Somewhere above, tiny mouths scraped algae from living leaves. The war had not been won. It had only moved to smaller ground, fought with smaller armies, where one mistake could still end everything. The keepers had not moved fast enough. Partula taeniata, Partula suturalis, a few others, not in the wild, where the wolf-snail still ruled, but in climate-controlled rooms where keepers tracked bloodlines like royal genealogies, and every birth got a number. Extinct in the wild. The phrase sounded clinical, until you realized what it meant, a creature that existed only because someone remembered to look back. The Rosy Wolfsnail had done what generalist predators do. It ignored the giant African land snail, too large and too armored, and hunted what could not hide and could not fight back. An evolutionary gallery, millions of years in the making, erased in less than a decade by a predator that was never meant to walk those forests. The Partula that remained were not saved. They were paused. Their forests did not remember them. At twilight in a London zoo, one snail glided across a fern frond, her shell catching the last light, alive in a world that no longer held her home. She did not know she was a memorial. She only knew the leaf was wet and she was moving. If stories like this one make you want to keep looking closer at the worlds we barely notice, the subscribe button is where the next one begins.